As the north wind's harsh gusts swept across a state erased from the map, its whistle, so reminiscent of winter, turned into a warning. The name of this state doesn't appear even in official records. It isn't mentioned in news bulletins, nor seen on road signs. And yet it exists, because the things people believe have been forgotten can be far more stubborn than we think. Their existence does not continue by waiting to be remembered. They exist without needing anyone's belief. Jacob had turned 21 a few days earlier, right after his birthday, as he crossed the city limits in his rusty truck. He was unaware of many things. He always carried a small key that had belonged to his father in his pocket. On this patterned, old key, a faint letter was engraved as if it belonged to someone. H. A short sentence attached to a will had told him the key belonged to one of the houses in the abandoned state. Open the house's heart. Setting out to fulfill his father's will, Jacob uttered his first and greatest mistake. The heart of the house. He must mean the fireplace or the stove. As the noisy truck passed the border, a single sheet of grey cloud blanketing the sky blocked the noon sun. The long stretch of asphalt road that seemed to run on infinitely had begun to crumble. Passing deserted gas stations, Jacob scanned the road to spot any kind of direction sign. Moving among the eerie shadows of shattered billboards lent an unsettling air to the town's desolation. There were not even bird calls. At last, when he saw a rusted entry sign swinging in the wind, he read aloud the only sentence where the town's name appeared. Welcome to St. Hollow. Quite a warm welcome, Jacob thought wryly. It was as if he had entered the state's town not from a city but through a rabbit hole. As Jacob moved along the main street, looking around, he saw mannequins smashed to pieces behind shop windows. Some seemed to have their eyes gouged out, others their mouths stuffed. The more he looked, the more he thought this place was not a wonderland, but a town of nightmares. From one of the loudspeakers dangling down from its pole, a crackling hymn could be heard. The sound seemed to crawl through wires coated in rust and spread with a muffled echo across the town's empty streets. The same verse, the same syllable, repeated incessantly, becoming more mechanical with each cycle. At the hymn's end, like a broken record, the echo of a monotone priest's Amen could be heard. When Jacob looked up, he noticed the speaker swaying slightly back and forth, as if taking a breath. The wind moaned as it passed through the wires, seeming to accompany the hymn. The broken windows of the abandoned buildings echoed this monotonous sound, sending it back down upon the town as if in prayer. For a moment, Jacob thought the sound wasn't coming from anywhere at all, but from the town itself, as if St. Hollow could still speak. Jacob had found the address from the will. The house was a dilapidated structure with a broken roof on a back street of the town. Whoever had lived there had left with the curtains drawn tight. The only interesting thing in the yard was the fragment of a bell standing before the door. As Jacob approached, he noticed a faded date written in chalk on the doorframe. October 31st, 1982. The old writing blended into the flaking wall, looking like an ordinary paint stain. Jacob didn't give the date much importance. Perhaps he shouldn't have. For sometimes a person can only hear what a number is saying when the time is right. For now, the young man's ears rang with the peaceful noise that ignorance brings. He took out the ornate key he had carried in his pocket along the way. The lock opened without resistance, as if it had been waiting for him for years. The instant Jacob cautiously cracked the door, The sharp scent of mold, cold iron, and wet wood filled his nose. He closed the door behind him and moved forward slowly. His strong body quivered slightly with the vague chill of familiarity. The fact that no one could see this sign of weakness saved him from embarrassment. Jacob did not know this house, but the house seemed to have been watching him for years. He wondered at the sudden trembling. After all, there was no one around who could harm him. But sometimes, when faced with things we think we know, we are far more defenseless than when confronted with the unknown. Shaking himself free of the dead weight upon him, Jacob began looking for what was called the heart of the house. His only option was to inspect the place and find whatever might be closest to a heart. The walls lining the corridor were adorned with black and white portraits. Frames were filled with faces whose eyes had been carved out. It looked not like an act of rage, but as if done with a ceremonial order and measure. Two objects left on the table at the center of the living room caught Jacob's attention. He approached and ran his hand over a dust-yellowed map. As he tried to figure out where it depicted, a photo with burned corners slid out from beneath the paper. The photo showed a large crowd gathered in front of a church. Looking closer, he noticed a boy in the middle of the group who resembled himself. He stood among men and women without smiling. Jacob couldn't recall ever having been to that church. He flipped the photo over and looked at the date, 1982. The faded number proved the boy wasn't Jacob. He hadn't even been born then. Jacob filed this away as irony and set the photo back on the table with a smirk. There was nothing to worry about. He was completely certain he had never been here before. The human mind, after all, first makes room for the lies that soothe itself. The map bore a simple image of the town rendered in rough lines. Jacob traced the crooked lines with his finger and began reading the street names. Town Hall, St. Agatha Church. His finger touched the line just to the right of the street. Foundry. The place between the foundry and the church was circled in red. Well, just below the circle, a shaky sentence had been scrawled in the ballpoint pen. When the heart stops, the bell falls silent. Jacob raised his eyebrows, caught between a smile and a shiver. The sentence struck him as funny. He thought it was a dreamer's fancy from the town folk. But when he recalled the heart his father's will had mentioned, he shuddered. His father had been a serious man. He wouldn't have left a foolish joke behind after his death. When a noise came from inside, Jacob set the items on the table as if caught in the act. The repeated sound came from the basement. Probably a malfunction, he said, taking refuge in the echo of his own voice. But there was no electrical system or water leak that could malfunction. As he neared the basement, the house creaked as if its breath were expanding. It was as though the hairline cracks in the walls were drawing the darkness of the basement inward. Within that darkness, a child's laughter rang out. It wasn't cheerful. It was a dry smile carrying notes of revenge. There can't be a child in the house, Jacob thought. The town was long abandoned. Forget children. There weren't even animals in the streets. Clearly, his father's death had shaken him and caused him to hear things that weren't there. Stop being ridiculous, he said, giving up on going down to the basement and shutting the door. He decided it would be better to continue his search from the upper floors. The wooden stair groaned deeply under Jacob's weight. A slight chill flowed through the gap of an open door upstairs. As soon as he stepped inside, His eyes went to the window. It was closed. Though the cold increased, there was no hole from which air could enter. He hugged his arms around himself to quell the oncoming wave of shivers. The room was small. In the exact center stood a broken pink crib. On the wall, 3 circles had been drawn in chalk. A small notch had been made in the center of each circle. Clearly, the child who had lived in this house liked drawing on the walls. Aside from a few items, it was a rather ordinary, empty room. There wasn't much besides plush dolls scattered across the floor. When Jacob bent to pick one up, a faint glimmer under the crib caught his eye. He reached his arm into the dark hollow and groped around until the shiny object met his hand. At last, his fingers struck something hard. When he stood, he held in his hand a strange jar containing a yellow liquid. He shook the glass with his thick metal lid. In the yellowed, transparent fluid, a small white orb resembling an eye was floating. When he shook the jar again to be sure of what he'd seen, the soulless organ with no pupil revealed itself in all its darkness. The young man let out a brief cry and hurled the jar to the floor. The metal lid grazed his hand, leaving a bloody cut. When the blood dripped from his hand onto the jar, he felt as if the whole house had trembled. Clutching his bleeding hand, Jacob hurried downstairs. His first thought was to leave the house, but he couldn't. His head was full of unanswered questions. Why had he found an organ in a child's room? Who had put it there? Did it belong to someone from the house? Why had his father sent him here? Perhaps the thing called the heart of the house was a real human heart. When he reached the living room, he was out of breath from the stress pressing upon him. He reviewed what had happened so far. The strange photo he'd found upon entering, the child's voice from the basement of an abandoned house, the eye fragment that seemed to belong to a child, judging by its size. They were all clues pointing to a small child. Had his father sent him to uncover an unsolved murder? But that makes no sense, Jacob thought, leaning against the wooden table. He was not a detective or a policeman, and none of his relatives had lived in this house. He had no reason to solve the case. Running his good hand through his hair, he said, "I need to bandage my hand and keep investigating," and had already pulled himself together. He headed to the bathroom to look for first aid supplies. It was such a creepy house that he approached each room cautiously as he crossed the threshold. He found the first aid kit in the white cabinet beside the bathroom mirror. He set the kit on the sink, took out disinfectant and a bandage. He groaned as the strong liquid touched the wound. He closed his eyes for a second or two for the throbbing to ease. He first felt the cold breath on the nape of his neck. He opened his eyes immediately. He looked in the mirror. No one behind him. "I'm starting to lose it," he chuckled. A child's giggle joined his laughter. He spun around. "Who's there?" No answer. He exhaled deeply and turned back to the sink. This time the cold breath was right in his face. He leapt backward and slammed into the toilet. As he headed for the door, it slammed shut in his face. "No!" Jacob cried. He was trapped in the bathroom. The already dim bulb began to flicker. Jacob spun around and around, searching for whoever was toying with him inside. He couldn't see anyone. Not until he looked at the mirror. At first, it was like a slight optical illusion. His reflection moved more slowly than Jacob. He drew closer to the mirror. He blinked and quickly raised his right hand. The reflection moved as it should. Then he slowly lowered his hand. The mirror was responding normally. "I'm stressing for nothing. Get a grip," he said, looking at his reflection. His words found no echo. He spoke again and again. Each time, his reflection seemed to mimic him using different words. The reflection didn't know the language it was imitating. Realizing this, cold sweat poured down Jacob's neck. His hands trembled. His eyes scanned the rooms, seeking an exit. He grabbed the soap dish and set to work on the door lock. After striking the latch a few times, he managed to break free. Before fleeing, he had the sense to snatch up the first aid kit. Back in the living room, he muttered, "Forget it. I don't care about the will. I'm leaving right now." He had barely taken a step toward the door when a creak from the floor beneath his feet made him flinch. When he lifted the rug, he noticed a hatch whose color blended with the floor. With one hand, he slid the light rug aside. Now fully revealed, the wide hatch stared up at him. He was determined to leave, but he also wanted answers. The answer he was looking for might be under that hatch. "Damn it," he muttered, and hesitantly lifted it. Rusted metal steps led downward into the depths of darkness. The chill rising from the dark passage reminded Jacob of the oddity in the bathroom. A cold breath seemed to brush his face again. Jacob set his foot on the metal stair. The farther he descended, the more the town's sound changed. The threatening north wind gave way to a humming like water. There was no water around. When he pulled out his phone to use as a flashlight, he understood the hum's source. The sound came from glass jars filled with liquid gently clinking together. There were dozens lining the walls. The eyes inside seemed to have witnessed something that should never have happened. Each jar was a silent apology saying, "I saw, but I didn't speak." With every step on the stairs, the walls of the cellar-like place widened. In the middle of the stone structure stood a red door. He approached the door that stirred both danger and desire and gripped the handle. To be cautious against the house's next surprise, he slowly extended his head through the crack. He groped along the wall and found the light. In the center of the room stood an enamel tub filled not with water, but with a pitch-black substance. The dense, sticky-looking surface reflected like a mirror. As Jacob drew near, the surface bubbled as if breathing. The heavy metallic smell of the air that the strange substance exhaled burned his nose. The bubbling increased. From beneath emerged an ominous body without eyes or mouth. "Jet black, you came back." When the sticky voice reverberated through Jacob's mind, he dropped to his knees. To come back, he must have been here before. Yet Jacob was sure he had never been. The strange being standing before him moved again, inside his mind. "I see everything in this town," it said, taking a step out of the tub. "Your first coming was in 1982. It freed its other leg from the tar and stood. Your second is today." The faceless figure, black from head to toe, slowly knelt on the ground before Jacob. "On your first visit, you took something. Now, you will give it back." Jacob trembled where he knelt. What had he taken? He hadn't even been born in 1982. Whoever stood before him must have mistaken him for someone else. He had no energy to answer. His tongue felt swallowed by his own shivering. When he felt the same coldness from the bathroom again on his nape, he turned immediately. He heard that child's giggle again. When he turned back, the faceless figure was gone, but the black substance still filled the tub. "Come closer," a voice rose from the depths. Jacob took a few steps unwillingly. He expected to see his own reflection on the surface, but there was no trace of him in the liquid. In place of his reflection, a faceless child appeared. As the child rose without lifting his head, Jacob stepped back. It was as if the air in the room had grown too heavy to bear the silence of that moment. From the black surface rose a muffled, penetrating bell tone. In the past, this sound had echoed through the streets of St. Hollow. Since the day the bell fell silent, it could only echo within the silent darkness of this cellar. The black surface rippled, and the light on the ceiling flickered several times. Of the small body rising from the sticky substance, only the eyes were visible. Two stark white spheres in the darkness suddenly turned toward Jacob. They had no eyelids. They resembled a baseball ringed with red veins. Jacob froze. He couldn't move even if he wanted to. All he could do was stare at the onyx eyes that had no discernible color. Those piercing eyes seemed to have swallowed all colors, leaving behind only a dark void. Jacob involuntarily reached his hands toward the child, but his hands did not plunge in like water. They felt as if they were trying to pierce a wall. The tar did not accept him, because acceptance always demands a heavy price. "What do you want?" Jacob whispered. A drowning voice eked out two scarcely intelligible words. "Give it back." Whose voice it was no longer mattered. Voices here had long abandoned their owners. The faceless figure that had emerged from the tub moments ago had said the same thing. Jacob didn't know what he was supposed to give back. Perhaps he didn't want to know, because to know would require a person to turn back and look at his own story, at his past. Just then, a fine rain of dust fell from the ceiling. The house groaned above as if taking a deep breath. The ground shook and stones flew from the cellar walls. Jacob hurried up the stairs and returned to the living room. He didn't want to be buried under the cellar. As the house still trembled, a wet redness appeared, where the eyes had been gouged out in the wall portraits. They were weeping blood. Though Jacob couldn't make sense of it all, he had already accepted that he was facing a supernatural event. The map on the table stirred slightly. The red circle around the well had shifted. It now sat exactly at the intersection of St. Agatha Church and the town hall. That intersection was the heart. Jacob went back to speak with the tarred being in the cellar to get answers. When he returned, a name swelled on the tar's surface. Agatha. Jacob recalled what his father had said about the church. A woman named Agatha had given her name to the church. Since then, the foundry, the bell, the unbaptized water, and sleepless nights had all gathered around Agatha and come to be associated with her. In 1982, the woman known as Agatha had melted the church bell in the foundry and sealed the well. After that, the townspeople never heard the church bell again. Now an unusual look of acceptance rested on Jacob's face. He didn't know the price he had to pay, but he would learn it tonight. The tar's surface trembled once more like a bell, and a deep sound arose. This time, Jacob didn't step back. For the first time after a very long silence, the state heard the bell's voice. Jacob placed his hands on the iron legs on either side of the tub. "What do you want from me?" he said. On the wall opposite the bathroom, a door appeared. When Jacob approached the door, he read the inscription carved upon it. "That which lies below makes the above forget." Jacob ran a hand through his hair and spoke again. "I don't understand what you mean." "Who is below?" The door opened with the sound of hinges. Someone was mocking him, pushing him into a game he had no desire to join. Jacob stepped inside. The ornate door led into a narrow tunnel lined with stone. The inside was stifling, the air heavy, breathing difficult. Jacob's heart began to pound. The idea of the earth suddenly covering him and filling his nostrils and mouth quickened his pulse. He had to get out of there as soon as possible. As he advanced, the tunnel widened and names carved into the stone walls appeared. Miriam, Oren, Ezra, Agatha, Jacob. Beside each name were marks that had faded with time. A cross for some, 2 notches for others. When Jacob saw his own name, an abrupt chill seized him. The space beside his name was blank. His debt had not yet been carved because he hadn't paid it. At the tunnel's end, narrow stone steps curled upward. Jacob proceeded with cautious steps, and at last the stairs brought him to a church's basement. The door was unlocked. Doors here were never locked, because only those accepted by the church could enter. Jacob stepped into the wooden pews under dim light. The resin scent accumulated over years had turned bitter with memory. The silence was almost as heavy as prayer. Before the pulpit, a prayer book with yellowed pages lay open. Its page had remained always at the same place. It was as if waiting for someone to come and turn the pages. As Jacob drew near, the book's page gently turned on its own. The words were legible. But the more he read, the more their meanings receded, the letters fleeing Jacob's mind. He carefully set the book back. Right beside it stood a silver cross he was sure he hadn't seen before. And yet, its familiarity pricked his heart. He reached for the cross. The silver surface suddenly cracked and flew from him. It was as if no sacred object could bear his touch. Perhaps he had committed some great sin in the past and was now being punished. When he reached the top of the tower, he was out of breath. The scent of rust, the mold borne by the wind, and the chill of stone mingled together. At the top, the bell swing that no one had touched for years stood empty. But what most drew Jacob's attention was where the bell should have been. The metal was gone, removed. Only a round shape remained on the wall, like the trace of a memory. The stone seemed still to remember the weight that had once hung there. Jacob approached and ran his hand over the empty space. The cold air cut at his fingertips. "Was it me who took this?" he whispered, his voice dissolving into the stone's texture without echo. From below rose an indistinct hum mingled with the wind. It was as if the church were answering his question not with words, but with remembrance. At first, the church answered Jacob's whisper with silence. Then a pale light seeping through the stained glass slowly filled the space. The colors of the long-forgotten panes seemed to whisper an answer. Yes. Jacob's throat went dry. For a moment, the light reflected from the glass turned into shadow play on the walls. The past appeared before his eyes, as if carved into the stone surface. In 1982, his face had been the same, but his gaze utterly different. That night, he had removed the bell that Agatha had melted in the foundry. He had wrenched it from its place, silenced it, and carried it down. Jacob's pulse thudded in his ears. His head was more confused than when he had first arrived. It was impossible for him to have been here at the date mentioned. He had been born 10 years after the bell's disappearance. There had to be some grave mistake. Jacob didn't want to bear another man's sin. He was innocent and had never laid hands on the bell. But the feeling of familiarity in his hand was as if it still remembered the cold of metal. Suddenly the walls, the stained glass, the stone columns, all began to whisper the same word. Jacob. Jacob sighed. Whoever the sin belonged to, it was clear he would not be allowed to leave without resolving it. He needed to bring the bell back to the town. He removed the long chain where the metal's tip had once been fastened. Slinging it over his shoulder and securing it, he set off for the foundry, the place where these events had begun. When he left the church, He noticed tiny differences around town. The buildings were the same, but the distances between them had changed. Jacob knew the foundry's location only from the map. After a short walk, he'd reached it. The name etched into the building was infuriating. Agatha's Forge, Jacob said in a weary voice. He pushed open the massive metal door and entered. The smelting furnace was extinguished, but the ashes gave off a warmth as if it had been used recently. Bell molds lined the walls. Some were cracked, some remained solid. On the far wall, a massive, striking mold bore the name Agatha. He reached out and took down the heavy mold. He fastened the chain he'd brought from the church to the mold's mouth and hefted it. He didn't know how to operate the foundry, yet he carried a strange familiarity, as if he had once watched someone else use it. He grabbed a few bits of metal from the shelves. He set the bell mold over the fire pit he had managed to rekindle. Within seconds, the metal pieces melted and took the shape of a bell. As the flame in the foundry lit Jacob's sweaty brow, the shadows on the walls seemed to writhe. As the molten metal poured into the mold, a high hiss burned the room's air. Jacob watched the bell slowly take form. Its shape was being born not out of fire, but out of a memory. "Agatha," he said, his voice reduced to a whisper. "Forgive me." As if it had heard the name he breathed, the metal swelled. The bell had come to life again. Jacob didn't know why Agatha had destroyed it, but if her spirit still lingered here, she must feel him now. Just then, a murmur rose from outside. He first thought it was the wind, but within the sound was the echo of a shuffling crowd. Jacob slung the chain over his shoulder and pried the mold free. He walked toward the exit. Shadows flowed between the walls and piled up at the door. A being without eyes or mouth approached him and left a whisper, "Give it back." It was the faceless figure he had seen at the tub, known as the well. It resembled a hunger unable to decide which thing belonged to whom. Jacob didn't stop. When the faceless figure lunged, he dodged left and sprinted out of the foundry. Without looking back, he reached the church door, climbed the stairs, braced the mold against the tower's cold irons. He fastened the chain. His body trembled, but the tremor was not fear. It was the vibration of metal being reborn. The bell came back to life in Jacob's hands. First a moan, then a peal. The sound filled the tower's chest. Stone walls shuddered. The stained glass lost its colors for an instant and regained them. Below, the tar surface of the well rippled. The silence cracked. The jars of eyes on the walls popped and creaked. The bell rang 7 times. With the 7th stroke, the heart of St. Hollow settled back into place. The red circle on the map had fixed itself. The church bell had not rung for years because the very concept of time had been withdrawn from the town. When time withdrew, the clocks stopped, but the shadows kept living. On St. Hollow's clock tower, the hands had been stuck at 10:31. The calendars marked the night of October 31st, Halloween of 1982, the last night when children wore masks and adults could hide their sins as jokes. That night, the town's heart had stopped. The bell sank into silence and time lost its rhythm in St. Hollow. But each strike of the bell also summoned an unpaid debt. The faceless figure outside was still out there somewhere. When Jacob looked through the window, he saw the figure moving from the church door to the courtyard, from the courtyard to the town hall, leaving tarry traces. In the town hall's basement, the testimony of a sin committed years ago had been reduced to writing. On the night the bell fell silent, names had been carved into the walls. Jacob knelt in the tower's chest. His breath was ragged. but his heartbeat had begun to steady. The tar surface below no longer called to him. The site of the trial had shifted once more. "I've paid the debt. I repaired the bell. Leave me be now." He heard a faint laugh. "You think destroying the bell was the point?" The laughter swelled. "You will pay your father's debt." A strange woman's voice echoed through the church. His father had been a serious man, but not a bad one. Jacob loved his father. After his death, Jacob had been shaken, plunged into deep depression. He could not even recall some of the things he had lived through. Grief had struck him deeply. He didn't believe his father had any great debt. He would handle that too and leave. "Where to now?" Jacob asked. His feet answered his own question by carrying him onward. When he left the church, the town had been swallowed by shadows. It was dark. The newly working clock showed midnight. It was daylight a moment ago, Jacob muttered to himself. But he had no time for more questions. He hurried down the steps and headed to the town hall. The front door was locked. To get inside, he climbed through the archives room window, which was always left ajar. The fact that he knew this route surprised him. Upon entering, he caught the ink smell of the archive. It was dusty inside, yet many facts about the past could be found in the records here. After a few minutes of searching, he found nothing useful. Deciding to go to his next idea, the basement, he left the room. The basement was not as frightening as he had imagined. It seemed it had once been used as a meeting room. Ledgers sat on metal shelves lining the walls. After examining each file one by one, he broke open the locked drawer of a wooden desk and found a leather-bound book. On its cover, list of debts. As Jacob skimmed the lines, he came upon his own name. At the top of the page, the date showed the day of the events, October 31st, 1982. Name, Jacob H. Name of the crime, witnessing. Witnessing what? I didn't see anything. Jacob flung the book away in anger. What is this nonsense? Enough! As he shouted, unable to control his temper, the pages rustled on their own and stilled on a specific page. When Jacob picked the book up again, he saw his father's name at the head of the line. Edward H. The date pointed to long before October 31st. His father's debt had been carved into these pages in blood. Name of the crime, theft of memory. Theft of memory, Jacob read on, tracing the lines about his father with his finger. The debtor believed that people stored their memories in their eyes in order to reach a final goal, and had conducted an experiment to collect those memories. Since he had used municipal resources during the experiment, he owed a large amount of money. What? My father wasn't someone who would run experiments, and eyes, how could he collect them? A cold drop of sweat slid down Jacob's neck. His hair bristled. The house he had gone to as soon as he arrived in town. His father had given him that house's key. Inside, he had found a photo of a boy who resembled him, and the cellar known as the well had been full of jars of eyes. No. He threw the book to the floor. My father, did he steal people's eyes? The woman's laughter returned. Now do you understand your father's sin? Even if my father did all that, I never witnessed anything, Jacob said, looking up. He did not know where the woman's voice came from. The woman speaking to him passed through the basement wall and came right up to him. It was the faceless black figure. Who are you? Jacob asked. He was no longer afraid. All he wanted was to solve the matter. You know me, son, Agatha. Her voice turned into a whisper, echoing everywhere. Jacob stepped forward. I don't know you. I don't know what's going on here. My father. Why would he do this? What is my crime? She laughed again, this time angrily. Why would your father? I stopped trying to make sense of that madman long ago. Your father was a murderer. He even killed his own son. My father's only son is me. You know nothing. Poor thing Agatha approached Jacob. She touched his sweaty face with her fingertips. Paying for a sin you don't understand must be hard for you. Then enlighten me, Jacob said, slipping from her hand. I was kind enough to let you remember your father fondly before you die. If you want to know, then listen. Agatha suddenly appeared behind Jacob. He spun quickly and came face to face with her. Giggling, Agatha continued, Years ago, your father and I were lovers. Edward didn't love me as much as he loved his experiments. Still, I would do anything for him. One day, his experiments got out of control. The mayor, pursuing his own ends, trusted your father and financed him. They wanted to seize total control of the town, and your father was the mayor's chief investment. He took one child from every family first. He gouged out one of their eyes. Jacob couldn't bear it and cut in. Wait, why would my father harm children? Have you lost your mind? The woman exhaled angrily. Your father was as incapable of listening as you. He took the children because they carried their family's thoughts, views, and memories. The poor children who witnessed everything yet kept silent because they were small. I couldn't ignore that. I respected Edward's experiments, but involving children was unacceptable, especially when we had a little boy of our own. Jacob trembled. He had had a sibling. What happened then? To my brother. Don't call him your brother, Agatha roared. A corrupt bloodline like yours cannot be his kin. My son was innocent. Your father used him in his experiments. Every night he would sneak down to the basement to watch those perverse trials. My son was forced to witness it all. Witnessing. That was Jacob's sin carved into the ledger. But he had never been part of his father's experiments. As if reading his soul, Agatha continued, You wonder why the sin of witnessing is your debt, don't you? I stirred a small group, those aware of the events, into revolt to stop your father and the mayor. The town turned on itself. Everyone accused their neighbor of turning a blind eye to the experiments. The people were determined to wipe out anyone close to your father. They wanted to root out the filth. I can't blame them. She drew a deep breath and went on. One night they broke into my house and dragged me to the foundry. Thankfully, my son was with his father again, down in that basement. Though I said I was innocent and knew nothing, I couldn't stop the enraged crowd. They burned me together with the church bell in the foundry, Agatha said, showing her body with outstretched hands. Nothing of me was left but a piece of blackened skin. Jacob was too shocked to speak. He had known nothing. Pacing the room, Agatha continued her story. The church bell was merely symbolic. The town blamed the disappearance of children on the insufficiency of my faith. So they burned the church's heart, the bell, as a symbol of rebirth. But only curse and rage were reborn. I didn't even need to take revenge. The town cursed itself. Everyone fell into a deep sleep out of time. Over the years, their bodies rotted away. The oddities you see are the outbursts of bodiless spirits. And your son. What happened to him? Jacob couldn't help asking again. Fearing she would be angered, he took a few steps back. The woman slowly turned her head to Jacob. My son. When the town tore itself apart, Edward must have taken him and escaped the house using the basement's secret passages. Years after my death, I revived in this pitiful body and searched for your father. When I found him, He was with another woman in another house. You were there with them. I had not found my own son. I thought your father had mended until he went down into his basement. Then I saw my son, tied to a chair. He looked like a wild animal. Edward had imprisoned my boy. I was furious. I wanted to take revenge at once and kill everyone there, including you, but far from the town. My power was weak. I was only an ordinary ghost. Agatha approached Jacob. The end of her story was near. Her rage began to surface. You, Jacob H., you stole my son's eye. Your father continued his perverse experiments on his children. He gouged out my son's eyes and transplanted them into yours. He died of blood loss, but you lived. That's why this town feels familiar to you. You walked the streets where my son grew up and went to the house where he lived. That is why, for the sin of witnessing the perverse experiments my son testified to, I will judge you. As soon as she finished, Agatha lunged at Jacob. Both fell to the floor. The woman was far stronger than she looked. Jacob could barely move. He struggled to pry off the black hands on his throat, but could not. As his consciousness dimmed from lack of air, he grabbed the old lamp fallen to the floor and smashed it against Agatha's head. When the woman reeled, Jacob sprang up and ran. He burst outside. It was still dark. The only way to escape her was to burn her again. Without wasting time, he sprinted to the foundry. Agatha was on his heels. He shoved the metal door and rushed in, moving at once to fire up the smelting mechanism. Lighting the pit wasn't hard, but with a hunting spirit on his tail, it was harder than usual. Agatha burst in. Grabbing a long, sharp rod, she came at Jacob. Jacob was at home in the foundry. Clearly his brother had crept through here many times. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the chains used for hanging the bell. One lay right at his right forward diagonal. As Agatha charged him, Jacob snatched the chain and wound it around her. "You wretch!" Agatha roared. Jacob didn't stop. With all his strength, he shoved the struggling spectre into the fire pit. Agatha realized she would lose. One foot slipped into the pit. The angry flames scorched them both. "I'll take you with me," she screamed. Jacob resisted. He had no intention of burning. When he pushed her, both her feet dangled over the pit. Before she fell, Agatha plunged her finger into Jacob's left eye. The thought of someone else using her son's eyes burned her within. Jacob roared in pain and, with the strength of adrenaline, pushed Agatha into the pit. His left eye had popped out and now swung beneath his chin. The woman was gone, but she had taken one of his eyes. Jacob was in agony and losing blood. He ran to his truck to get out of town at once. As soon as he sat behind the wheel, he glanced at the mirror. His shattered left eye still dangled down. His reflection grinned at him. The person in the mirror wasn't him. He had never been himself, because the eyes he saw did not belong to him. He started the truck and hit the gas. He would manage somehow with the first aid supplies in his pocket until he found a hospital. In agony, he drove past the town's borders. Thankfully, the town his father had moved to was near St. Hollow. He stopped in front of the hospital and collapsed to his knees as he got out. A few doctors rushed out and carried him inside on a stretcher. When he woke, his left eye was gone, but he was still alive. When he was discharged and returned home, the reality of the past hit him in the face. His father had lived in this house and carried out experiments on his son in a secret basement. Jacob found the door to the basement. When he went inside, he saw once more the jars filled with eye fragments. His stomach couldn't take it. He turned away at once. When his foot banged into a large red chest, he cried out in pain. He didn't want to see what lay inside, but his curiosity won. He opened the lid. Jacob was horrified. Inside were pieces of skin belonging to a small body. It was as if the skin had been peeled whole from the body. It resembled an empty husk. He ran upstairs and fetched the childhood photos his mother had hidden before she died. He stood before the mirror and examined himself. His face didn't look as he remembered. His own eyes were brown, but he had taken his brother's blue eyes. The child in the photo had dark skin and black hair. His own body was pale, his hair light brown. His father had not only changed his eyes, he had changed his skin. This body wasn't his. As he looked in the mirror, the horror in his heart grew like an avalanche. His reflection stared back at him with the most chilling smile he had ever seen. The person in the mirror was his brother. Neither the reflection nor the body belonged to Jacob. Backing away, he ran to the kitchen. Without hesitation, he plunged the first knife he found into his other eye. He roared with pain but didn't stop. Again and again he drove the blade into his eye socket. When he fainted from blood loss, he understood there was no turning back from his decision. He was dying in someone else's body. The St. Hollow curse settled upon Jacob like death and chased his soul down to the deep pits of fire. His body fell into an endless sleep in his own house, and unable to defy time, decayed alone.